Hello there guys, Daniel Childs back here again. It's Monday and once again for the second show running we're going to be talking about the battle for Chelsea. We spoke about it yesterday, my initial thoughts and reaction. Todd Boehly versus Behdad Eghbali, Clearlake, you know, the whole situation regarding Chelsea FC, because we got a massive story today, inside story from The Athletic, that has a lot of detail, a lot of new information, I think kind of almost in a way backing up what we've already heard with initial reports, but give some depth, give some interesting talking points, and obviously something we're going to cover because it's so big for Chelsea, and also a potential timeline for when a resolution of some kind will be found. So please do like, please do subscribe. Before we get into it, I wrote a massive piece on my Substack. If you haven't subscribed to my Substack or followed it, please go and do so. It's free to do. I try and get 1 to 2 pieces, I'd say one kind of generally out there per week. We've discussed the midfield situation, recruitment, some other things as well. It's just sometimes maybe things I don't cover on my show or subjects in a little bit more depth. This kind of is a lot of what we're talking about at the moment, but it's a long piece. I kind of just woke up and wrote about nearly 2,000 words on the situation because obviously there is a lot to say. So it'd do me a massive favour and would really be appreciated if you could go and check that out, go and support the written work as well. Links will be not only in the description on YouTube, but also via the podcast description if you go and check that out. So let's jump into it. So this is a massive piece, Liam Toomey, Simon Johnson and Adam Crafton. So there's a lot of depth in here, and it's one of those kind of big pieces. It kind of reminds me of the usual Athletic pieces when a manager's been sacked, but this is kind of the breakdown, the breaking point, why the marriage is now in tatters. And I think a lot of it, like we spoke about a lot of this, kind of the difference in view around Chelsea. I think a lot of this is kind of in depth. Now, there are key takeaways here. I think some of them include a recent meeting between Eghbali and Boehly to kind of find some resolution with this, but also some of the other things in terms of the stadium, which has been an ongoing headache, I think, for the new ownership, not only including Boehly but Eghbali as well and Clearlake, and them resolving that apparently is a point of friction. Recruitment is a point of friction, and kind of how the club should be run day to day is also a point of friction. There is a lot of mudslinging as well in this piece. I don't think anyone comes out of this looking particularly great, even though my personal opinion, as we spoke about yesterday, is my preference is out of the two of them for Todd Boehly. There is a lot of to and fro and pointing fingers, and kind of it doesn't make Chelsea's decision makers or owners look that great. It looks at times a little bit childish, but that is the position we're in, and that is where we are, unfortunately. So this is it. Let's break down some of the bits from the piece that I'll link below, so please go and check it out in its full context. So Boehly, it says here, Boehly has been the name most cited, often in headlines criticising Chelsea's transfer policy and the face of online memes, mocking the club for outspending their rivals while labouring in the middle of the Premier League table. However, and we spoke about this yesterday, this is just another rubber stamp on this, he has not led recruitment at Stamford Bridge since January of 23, when he relinquished his interim sporting director title and signalled that he would step back from day-to-day responsibilities. So again, to Gary Neville, to everyone in media who continues to talk about Todd Boehly as if he is the guy leading things, I think at this point, if you're still talking in that sense, I don't know why we should take you seriously. It's not that anything you say about the club has no merit, but these are just kind of basic facts now. Like when people make their arguments about Chelsea's ownership and who's making the decisions, and they're still talking it as if Todd Boehly is the guy just there willy-nilly, making everything happen. It just isn't the case. So again, just reiterate that point. And that's why a lot of the friction is there naturally. Just logically, why would there be friction if Boehly was the one running things, right? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. But then we get into specific transfer examples of how it has shifted since that initial period. One of those is, of course, the signing of Mykhailo Mudryk in January of 23, when Eghbali and Winstanley were flying to Turkey to kind of make that deal with Shakhtar happen for an initial 70 million euros. I mean, that is a deal that has really hung over Chelsea since then and has not looked good on the club at all. It also talks about the fact that Winstanley and Eghbali were massively in there for, of course, the negotiations for Enzo Fernandez in the same window. and the fact that Winstanley and Stewart have basically continued to work closely with Eghbali on a day-to-day operations basis at Stamford Bridge and Cobham. So the fact that, of course, Clearlake owned 61.5% of the club's shares, that's why Eghbali is the powerful presence at Chelsea Football Club in kind of raw terms. He owns most of, or Clearlake owns most of the shares. He's the guy at the top. So that is why that trio, I continue to talk about that trio, because they are the ones that, if you just want to look on a timeline, we will get into how Boehly is still involved in having a say over decisions. But in terms of the power from day to day, that's where the difference is, and that's where the distinction is. So apparently the cultural difference is over the co-owners operate, basically. So Boehly, Pochettino, obviously this is the big thing, the private dinner that happened on a Friday evening before Chelsea's final game last season against Bournemouth. And of course this was something that even Pochettino spoke about in his post-match press conference, and this is where we started to see the public distinction and difference between the two of them. When Stanley and Stewart as well were thrown out to see Boehly the week before his dinner with Pochettino to explain their thinking about making a coaching change, he responded apparently in supportive terms at that meeting, though his subsequent words and actions were construed very differently. So it is a bit mixed with Boehly, because it seems like maybe towards the other key decision makers at Chelsea, he's saying one thing, but then maybe in public or in different quotes, he's saying another. So you have to factor that in when we're thinking about Boehly and Eghbali, and maybe it not being as black and white as the good guy versus the bad guy. That's, that's not, unfortunately, the way football works. I always do say this about football, especially at the elite level. There is a lot more grey than I think some people want there to be. But another thing that made me laugh and chuckle was this line that Eghbali is obsessed with player trading. Who could have guessed? I mean, what gave you that impression? Probably the understatement of the century. The idea that Chelsea are obsessed and the current decision makers are obsessed with player trading is the most obvious thing I think any of us could kind of write down. It is so clear. You don't have to kind of be an insider to grasp that. I mean, maybe just having it written down in this sense kind of gives you confirmation, but the fact that, we could just look at the evidence in front of us as we do consistently, and you can kind of come to a conclusion. I think it's nice that you get it a little bit more in writing from, reputable reporters, but at the same time, it's kind of quite evident Chelsea have a serious problem with player trading and being obsessed with it. That is not surprising. And then we move on to, I guess, the whole stadium situation. Now, a lot is said in this piece in terms of who's been responsible or who's been overlooking it. I've made shows about the stadium before, and there still remains, of course, a real big conflict, obviously, or just like, conversation. The Chelsea pitch owners, I'm a shareholder, as others are as well, of not wanting to move away from Stamford Bridge. We spoke about the potential of moving to Earls Court, which personally for me is actually a great potential resolution. But the problem is that even realistic or feasible? This has been the constant headache of not only this ownership, but the previous ownership. So it's not that the stadium isn't relevant and there isn't a difference between these two. It's a huge thing, whatever happens to Stamford Bridge. But in itself, that's a separate show because we've been talking about it for so long. But clearly there are differences of opinion, and maybe Boehly feels a lot more strongly about getting that over the line and that kind of being a big legacy for him, comparative to maybe Clearlake. But at the same time, I feel like with either route there, I think that for both of them, there are going to be similar headaches. I think that's kind of the reality of Stamford Bridge, unfortunately. Then we get into this meeting where apparently Boehly and Eghbali agreed that he and Clearlake would explore possible buyout options in light of the breakdown in their relationship. People familiar with Boehly's thinking on the matter believe that there will be a clear indication of the direction of travel within the next 2 months. But I guess the big question, and they say this here, what does that mean? And what does that mean? Does that mean Boehly leaving and Clearlake buying basically Chelsea for themselves? Boehly getting enough investment, which he believes he can get, to then give a sizable offer to Clearlake that they want to move on. I just want to talk about this because we didn't maybe talk about it as much in yesterday's show, and I did talk about this in my piece of kind of the distinction and difference between Boehly and Clearlake. An expertise, very much prioritised, that you build that team below, you give them the day-to-day running, and you aren't constantly them, micromanaging. That's an accusation that's been made at Eghbali. Eghbali feels differently in a sense of very much, wanting to be in control of that investment and making sure it's in the right hands. I dispute it's in the right hands, but in the case of that, that's their priority, so that's the difference there. But then also in terms of transfer strategy and the way you look towards the academy, I find it actually interesting when I was starting to write that piece, and you think about the timeline of things when Boehly was the interim sporting director. Now, he'd done a lot of things that I've criticised, others have criticised, and you look back, that wasn't a great window. But one of the more interesting things was the contract approach and stance to academy graduates. If you remember, Reece James was signed to a long-term deal. Armando Broja was signed to a long-term deal. Trevor Chalobah had his already boosted contract under I think it was the last year of the Abramovich tenure, but it was extended in November of 2022. And also the Mason Mount contract negotiations that just before the World Cup in 2022 looked to be at a very good place, a very healthy place, with Boehly and Eghbali leading those negotiations. Of course, Chelsea signed, effectively got Christopher Nkunku over the line before Winstanley and Lawrence Stewart arrived. I always think the key thing about that Mason Mount contract dispute was, of course, Mason returned from the World Cup, and things looked very different once Winstanley and Stewart were in place. Now, I think that there is a similarity in terms of believing you invest in young players and you bring them up, you hopefully buy the next big superstars, and that's how you build a better football team. Now, I think the end point maybe for Clearlake and Boehly is very different. I think Boehly has spoken about this publicly. It's to win. It's something he said very consistently. I contest whether that's the priority for Clearlake. I do think it should be the objective of a football club to build a successful football team. That's kind of the point, isn't it? I think that's something that does concern football fans, and does, especially when you're investing as much as Chelsea have. If Chelsea didn't have the financial capacity to invest what they have, it's a very different situation, and fans, of course, have to change their expectations naturally. That doesn't mean there's anything worth looking at Chelsea or supporting. Chelsea have been around for a very long time, and Chelsea fans of my generation have been blessed to see the greatest and most successful years of the club. I will be supporting this club for the rest of my life, whether they're in the Premier League, in the Champions League, in the Championship, in League One, League Two or below. That's that's the nature of football. But the reality is that Chelsea still have the financial ability to spend a lot of money, and I think the logic from a lot of people is they see over $1 billion spent. Some of that, of course, through when Todd Boehly was interim sporting director, but they see that, not see an improvement from the club. And I think they're right to ask questions, serious questions. And I think that distinction for me between Boehly and Eghbali is Boehly, I think, maybe has a bit more appreciation for what Cobham, the academy, can bring to you. And I also think he has more of an appreciation, especially with his experience with the Dodgers, that to be a successful sporting side, especially a football side, high wages, high investment, unfortunately, is just a given. You have to invest seriously on big players. If you don't, you will be left behind. That's just the correlation between wages and success has been there in the Premier League for a very long time, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. So I think there is that distinction there. So what happens from here, I guess, is still the huge question regarding Chelsea. Initial kind of polls I've seen just of fan sentiment on social media, of course, anecdotal, isn't gauging everyone inside Stamford Bridge, but it has been unanimous in front of, in support of Todd Boehly. That does not surprise me. It does not surprise me in a sense, because I think in a sense people have seen maybe with their own two eyes and listened to things over the past year and have come to that conclusion when they've looked at the business and the way the club was operated. This is a club that still does not have a front of shirt sponsor, when Clearlake boasted about how great commercially they are. Eghbali, I referenced this piece as I did in my Substack, that there was a piece on the eve of this season. We didn't actually talk about it on the show, from Sam Wallace in the Telegraph, that talked about Eghbali's kind of disdain for the Abramovich era and disdain for the way Chelsea were run, disdain for the fact that Man City's academy players are always ready to play in the Premier League, but our academy players have to go out on loan. Hilariously forgetting that only a year before he arrived at the club, Chelsea won the Champions League against Man City with Cobham graduates starring in our win. And the club was so badly run as they won the Champions League, as they won the Club World Cup. I had frustrations with the end of the Abramovich era. It's gone now. But, to even talk about that in disdainful way when you have overseen major failure, nothing even coming close to what Abramovich did, it's really it's so tone deaf to talk in that capacity, and it's why people are so frustrated, because they see a guy in Eghbali who seems to think he has all the answers, who seems to think he's smarter than everyone else, and they see a club just objectively look like it's not being well run. So this is where we've ended now, where Boehly clearly feels that he can no longer work with Clearlake. Now, I got a great comment in my show yesterday, as I know many of you commented that, you know, maybe as well we need to look at Boehly in the sense that he did not pick the right partners to go into this ownership. And I think that absolutely is a valid criticism. Now, you do have to throw some context in there that the sale of Chelsea was so unique in football history, in the sense that it was a sanctions period, a period when there was a ticking clock for Chelsea as a football club that was quite stressful. Chelsea and the ownership did not have, or the custodians of the club in that short period, and getting this takeover over the line was not a case of they could wait for months and months and months and months, which I think we would have liked to have happened, because maybe there would have been more due diligence and there wouldn't have been such a rush to get something over the line, and there was a deadline for bids to come in and all of that stuff. So maybe there was more of a rush process than Boehly would have liked, but still he bears responsibility for getting into bed basically with Clearlake, and now we are where we are. It's just interesting for me to see with Boehly who he sees as the people to get that investment to make him kind of the key power at Chelsea, or for him to implement what he wants to do. We'll have to see how that develops. Will old names creep up? The sort of names I saw Nick Candy reference the other day, if you remember that name from the takeover process. We'll see how that develops. But yeah, I think that unanimous in my comments, unanimous everywhere else I've seen so far, is that Todd Boehly is the popular figure. But this is a mess. It really is. It's not a good situation. It really isn't. And I can only imagine maybe the impact this is going to have on the players, on the season. But it's where we are, and it's just interesting to see how much of the dirty laundry is starting to come out now, and everything that's going to follow from that. So those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below, and I will see you again very soon. All the best.